talk a little bit on the payment-centric view and how that fits into the crowd and what those unique challenges are. Obviously, that's not the first thing you get out of bed in the morning thinking about. Crowdsourcing might be the passion that you all have, and then it gets to the reality of running a business and how do you enable your business to scale and run operationally smooth. And the crowd, certainly from a business perspective, has created some new challenges from a back office perspective. So I'll talk about that a little bit before I start on myself. So I'm a marketing professional, have been my entire career. I've kind of gone from big company down to small company. So I started at one of the biggest, GE. Then I went to Intuit, which makes QuickBooks and some of the various products, TurboTax, you might be familiar with. Went to NetSuite, where I thought I was being really innovative. They were one of the first cloud companies, Salesforce, NetSuite, and the such. And I was there for about 8 years running international marketing, branding, and demand generation. And at that point, honestly, I thought cloud was kind of at the innovative summit. And about 4 years ago, I joined Tipalti. I started seeing what they were doing, started seeing the spaces they were serving. Think of internet, online marketplaces, crowdsourcing, which is all basically, the decentralization of the economy. And it was obvious once you started looking at that is the future to me. And so I got pretty excited about that and made the jump. So I'll talk about this from a finance perspective, but if you think of all those companies I was at, it was basically the back office and helping companies scale their back office, and this is basically a continuation of that, but in the modern digital economy. And so I'll talk about the kind of lessons learned that can be applied. So Epi has his own version of this actually, which is probably arguably better than our version, but this is kind of the whole crowd space as we see it. When you look at all the different products, services, ecosystems, and the stuff like that, you can go through there, and we'll send out the presentation after. You can see every little kind of company that's an example. But crowdsourcing, honestly, while it still has a way to go and will expand tremendously over the years, it is very diverse in terms of the markets it's serving and the such like that. It's pretty hard to follow. We try and keep this updated, and honestly, every month there's a new space or a new rung in this piece. The tricky part with crowdsourcing is the crowd, right? You've got this monster crowd. Oftentimes it's not just US based, it's overseas, it's all over the place with different skill sets and the such. The key for these businesses is a two-sided marketplace. And so from a business perspective, both from a marketing sales perspective as well as from an operational perspective, it's really challenging. There really hasn't been many models in the past where you have to manage two sides of a business at once. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg conundrum. Do you go for demand and then they come to your website and they don't have the supply? Or do you focus on supply first? Once you get that supply set up, then you can focus on demand. Essentially, you have to do both. The companies we talked about, like Lyft, have multi-million-dollar budgets on both sides of the coin because it's as important to attract and retain your drivers in that kind of situation as it is to get the demand. Because if you get the demand, they come to the service and they can't find the supply, they're never going to come back to your service again. And so from a back office perspective, you have to look at your supply chain and how do you attract and retain that supply chain and provide an excellent experience to that supply chain, because that experience they have is actually going to be what keeps them. It's not only about money. Of course, you want to pay them the appropriate commission and the such, but you have to also give them a great experience. They want to continue working with you. And of course, as you need to expand your business, you will have VCs and investors and your own aspirations for growth. You'll have to go overseas, and that creates a whole nother set of problems, not just from a scale perspective, but a regulatory perspective. So that's what my talk will be about, and in context of the global scenario with the crowd, because the crowd really does enable companies to go cross-border, both on the demand side and the supply side, and what you need to worry about. The reasons for going global are pretty obvious. One, from a supply chain perspective, you're increasing your talent pool tremendously, and on the same token, you're actually increasing your demand, your ability to find demand, because they will need that global supply. The skill side, skills are different by region, by market, and the such, and particularly if you're providing unique skills that is being crowdsourced, you can apply that and use the global scenario to actually expand the value you're able to offer to companies. So diversity of options, controlling margins, obviously the hub and spoke model of you may have an account manager in the US, but you actually are sourcing some of those skills overseas. And so there's a variety of different benefits. On the other side of it, what has to be thought of is the scale of your company. There's process complexity, there's scale issues related to that, and probably the part that's most overlooked is the regulatory and risk issues related to going cross-border. And so I'll talk about all those issues shortly. So the first kind of lesson learned as you think of setting up your business today and you think of setting up your business 3 or 4 years ago, the companies we've worked with that have been most successful have gone into it with a lean philosophy in mind. How do you set up your business so that all your dollars, all your time, and all your investments are focused on marketing, sales, the product experience, and wherever possible, the minutia of business and scaling your business operationally, you simplify that and streamline it so you don't have to invest more and more people and more costs in fulfilling that scale as you keep growing. The worst thing from a business perspective is you triple growth and you have to triple costs in alignment with that. At least if you're going to triple costs, put that in the growth side of the business so it pays off in spades from a growth perspective. But you still have to operate in a lean, proper way that delivers the right experience from a demand side and a supply side to your partners and your customers. So that's kind of the first piece. A few kind of tips as you think about that. Friction. So where are the friction points and how do you remove them, but remove them in a cost-effective manner? So proactively looking at those friction points and not just accepting them as a status quo, not just saying, well, this process is the way it's always been done, and therefore we're going to keep doing it, and as it gets worse, we'll either accept that it's not a good process, or we'll just throw people at the problem. Either of those decisions are bad, and it just won't, your business will not be competitive. It'll be bypassed by others in the future if you don't kind of question that status quo and look for better ways to solve for those problems. So that's kind of the first mentality. Global is related to that. So when you look at your processes and you're looking at those friction points and how to address it, you're going to have to go global at some point from a growth perspective, from a supply perspective and such. And so how do you make that as effortless as humanly possible? You're going to need to, in the case of Tipalti, pay a supplier around the world, and it needs to be as seamless as the US experience. Right now, it's basically completely two divert processes. The US pays typically will get a fairly simple experience generally. And overseas, we talk to many companies that simply say, we're not going to these countries because operationally it's too difficult, we don't know how to handle that, and the such, or they end up with 10 different banks. And that's just an experience, a kind of example from a payment experience, but you could probably go through every single operational aspect of your business and identify a similar reality there. And of course, kind of how do you put the infrastructure to grow so that you don't have to keep ripping or replacing your systems over time. This is a good data point here, but 96% of partners say the payment experience is important, and that's not a shocker. But it's not about the payment only. It's about the experience they're having with the payment. And similarly, it'll be the other interfaces that they're having with your portals and with your account managers and the such like that. But you have to deliver that experience ultimately. In terms of cross-border intelligence, so when you go global, there's a lot of repercussions. On the payment side of things, for an example, payment errors go up dramatically. So if you think about it, when you look at US versus UK versus Russia versus Ukraine versus Argentina, they actually, all the banking systems have different requirements of fields that need to be gathered, the nomenclature, and all the such. And so if you don't have that internally, either you don't have an expert on staff that knows all those kind of 26,000 rules or sorts, you will have a spike in payment errors. And that's not an experience you'd have if you were only a US business. You won't know about the likelihood for payment errors as you go cross-border. And so you have to think about that proactively. And so you have to embed intelligence into your processes, your people, and your technology so you can proactively identify these issues before they happen. Similarly, on a payment method perspective, there are different preferences by region, by country, in terms of what payment methods are available, but also what payment methods people want to absorb. PayPal is very popular in many countries of the world, and there's many countries that either PayPal doesn't enable, or it does enable it, they just don't like it. The local jurisdictions don't like it, and the population. And so you have to enable choice so that you enable an efficient way to provide the right experience, right payment method to the right people in the right place. Similarly, currency. Most data points show that folks want to receive, and it's pretty logical, they don't want to receive US dollars. If you're not in the US and you're pushing US dollars on them, you're basically kind of enforcing a bit of an arrogant perspective. And it's not very difficult to go on Google and find data out there on folks want to get paid in their local currency and not have to go take your US dollar, transmit it to the bank and the such. And the folks that get that proactively are going to be one step ahead of their competition. Similarly on the experience side of things, so you think of the payment experience, you have to think of choice of payment method, of course access, so ability to pay people anywhere and not create friction by region, choice of currency. I think the most underrated of all these is visibility. So visibility on have you been approved as a supplier when you're on board? Visibility from a perspective of has your payment been approved? Has your payment landed? If there's a payment issue, making it as easy as possible to understand why was there a payment issue and how can they self-resolve those payment issues. That is basically underlining all that is about trust. And so how do you make that payment experience an extension of your brand experience with your partners? And so those are kind of some considerations there. Of course, from an error perspective, that's the basics. And if you have a high error rate as you're paying folks in any country in the world, that's basically the kind of, you basically can't pass the starting line. And so you definitely need to think of errors as a part of the payment experience, not just a financial process. It's not just about the bank fees that they charge the finance team. That's great for finance. It's actually about the experience on the other side of it. And then finally, we're in the generation of the digital economy. Most of these freelancers are interacting with your app and your experience digitally. It shouldn't always be a human being having to tell people their payment status, the issues, and the such like that. Think of enabling it through an app, through online, through a web browser. You want 24/7 visibility for the payees on the other side, the partners that you're dealing with. That's the expectation from the demand side. And you need to think of your partners in the same context. They are customers as well. And so how should you enable that? You're talking to folks who are digital first, and they're actually dealing with your company in a digital scenario. So you want to make sure that all those points of experience from a payment perspective are enabled that way too. And unfortunately, the banks are not going to be the ones that are going to be delivering that type of experience. I think this data point, I suppose, before I move on. So we've done a survey over hundreds of freelancers, actually Crowdsource Week, as well as Shareable, who's a kind of another sister entity, did a survey of freelancers around the world, and 74% of them would leave a marketplace because of a poor payment experience. It's that important to that experience. It's not just about the money. Tax compliance. So this is one of those areas that's kind of a blind spot for most companies. And honestly, ooh, what happened there? Do you guys hear me?
Yeah.
That's back. Okay, I thought the volume went out. But this is actually a little bit of, probably about 4 years ago, it was a little bit blind spot to Tipalti even. We have a number of clients, Amazon, Vimeo, Twitter, et cetera, like that. And they were aware of the changes in the tax regime because they saw the government, the IRS, has seen the workforce change. And the workforce has moved overseas. They'll still be a US citizen, but they'll be working in different places, moving around. That's really enabled by the gig economy. And for that reason, the whole IRS entity structure has changed, their kind of regime. And so they've kind of introduced this rule, and don't ask me please for the acronym, but FACTA. It's Foreign Accounting Tax something. And so, but essentially with this FACTA provisions, it puts the onus on the payer to collect the right tax form from the payee and then validate that information. And so as you have a global crowd, you have to actually build in your infrastructure into your processes. Ideally, one, you want to collect this tax information up front, because if the IRS is saying to a company that you have to, it's a payer who's now responsible for this tax regulation, that means you have to collect it up front to make sure that the IRS knows that you've collected the data. If you collect it right before you make payment, at the end of the year, you're already out of line with the rules and regulations. Once you collect the information, you actually have to have a process of validating that information. And so that's one of those kind of processes you have to put in place with your people, and you can either use technology, outsourcing, or of course people, which is probably the worst of the solutions, to absorb that. There's further requirements on then, based on the jurisdiction that your partner is in, when they provide the right W-8 form or the such, then in some countries and some territories you have to withhold these taxes. And then finally, of course, you have to kind of push that information into your 1099 and 1042S reports at the end of the year, as well as you have to remove that tax requirement that the IRS requires based on those territories from each payment. So that was a lot of boring information, but the key piece of it is that you have to proactively look at tax as part of the payment workflow. If you only look at payments as this, and you look at supplier onboarding as this, tax as this part of it, fraud maybe is worried by who knows in your company, and OFAC checking is worried by someone else. OFAC checking, if you're not familiar, is the U.S. anti-money laundering provisions and regulations. The rule is that you're supposed to be checking every single payee before every single payment in the U.S. and abroad, but abroad comes with many more risks. So you should be checking that every single time beforehand. And then overseas, there's actually about 5 other of these OFAC lists that you should be checking as well. And so it's just another piece that people think of payments as a transaction, and it actually is a process. These are parts of the process from regulatory perspective, a tax perspective, a partner experience perspective, and of course a financial reporting and fraud, and then a payment perspective that needs to be looked at as a kind of an end-to-end workflow. And all these kind of items like tax and the such come into play there. Oops. So kind of a summary. Approach the business with a lean philosophy. You do have to look at it as a two-sided marketplace, and the partner side of it is just as important as the demand side of it. But ideally, of course, you want as much of the investment in the business and the talent in your business focused on growth. And so what can you do on the other side of the business to make sure you're still able to attract as well as retain those partners with as good experience as possible, but you do it in a lean, repeatable, scalable way. And so think proactively about that. So it's not just you deal with it when a fire happens and you worry about it later. And what you end up if you take that approach is that you have Band-Aids all over your business and actually holds back your ability to grow faster over time. And so if you think more proactively 3, 4, 5 years out of where you want to take your business, and you put the operational processes in place to help you scale, that helps take those kind of barriers away so you can invest properly in the front part of the business. Second piece is when you go cross-border, you do have to embed intelligence through your infrastructure in supplier onboarding, from a tax perspective, from a fraud perspective, and the such from a kind of a choice perspective. Third piece is the experience, and I'd say kind of if you take away anything from this, it's the experience part of it. The payment experience is probably your single most important touch point in the entire experience you have with your partners, and every communication with those partners on their payment status, providing them choice versus telling them how they're going to get paid, forcing US dollars on them versus giving them a choice of local currency, maybe giving them a choice of early payments if they want to be paid faster than your typical payment experience. If you pay net 30 typically, but the partner really wants their money today, enable that. They'll give you a discount back in return for it, but think proactively about how you make this actually a benefit for attracting and retaining your partners, not just an operational process that you have to manage efficiently. It's far more than just minimizing payment errors and paying people cross-border. And then finally, the tax and the risk. As you go cross-border and global, you have to think about fraud more. You have to think of things like OFAC and the SDN, a watch list, and making sure that you have a process in place to check that. If you don't, we've had clients actually that have come to us because their banks literally shut them down, and you don't want to get close to that scenario. And from a tax perspective, you really need to kind of proactively think about that. I'm not going to talk about this too much. It's a holder slide, but we work with a bunch of people in the crowdsourcing space, such as House, Seeking Alpha, Amazon, and the such like that. Honestly, those are big companies, but most of the companies we're actually working with are more mid-markets, more of the hyper-growth and the mid-market scenario where you have this solved. At the larger companies, for the most part, even though there's some exceptions there, they're more in the realm of throwing bodies at it. And one day, as they have competition and the such that start taking market share, they'll look for ways to deliver a better experience and the such to keep up with the innovators in the space. But our kind of sweet spot is fast-growing companies and mid-market companies generally, with a few exceptions. So that's a presentation. Hopefully that kind of puts some light on the payment world, which people don't think about first thing. Any questions I can help answer for you?
Yeah. That's really a really great presentation. And by the way, yeah, that's a lot of big mistakes when companies, they go in without really thinking like what kind of a platform they're going to use for the payment system, and all of a sudden they find out it's a really big issue with the distributing the freelancers' money.
Yeah, it's
one question: how much of the percentage that these freelancers they lose when they do the when the exchange happens on the US dollar, for example, you mentioned? What's the percentage?
Oh, so the FX rates differ by country and by period of time. So, but in some countries, there have been scenarios where we have a number of clients in like Germany, UK, for example, where they're actually moving to us because the transaction rates, we sit on top of JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, which do have better FX rates than some countries, some other countries, banks, as well as just depending on the payer you're discussing. So we do have an economy of scale that's beneficial, and there's a savings there. It doesn't.
But it's not like PayPal.
It's not the driver. The driver is usually the experience that their partners are demanding currency conversion, or they're demanding I want to be paid my local currency, or at least have an ability to choose that. Similar to they're demanding I want choice of payment method. There sometimes is actually a saving both to the payee as well as to the company from a transaction rate, but it depends a little bit based on the country they're in, the business model they're in, what banks they use, and the such like that.
Okay. Question for Rob. Rob is going to have a workshop, so anyone who's running a platform is interested in a payment platform, he can really go in depth and see how you can really provide a solution for them. Oh, great. Thank you, Rob. Thank you for being a partner with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.